Welcome to CERT Rodeo in a Box, a training module to help you hone your skills as a CERT volunteer. Decision-making and problem-solving are critically important skills in emergency response. As a CERT volunteer, you'll need to be able to quickly identify current and potential problems and make sound and timely decisions that will affect the community, its response and recovery following an emergency or disaster. The following course was excerpted from our own CERT Rodeo. It will provide you with the framework to start your own dialogue and to work through several decision-making and problem-solving examples.
Hello, I'm Gary Thurman. I'm a retired police captain with 30 years experience in law enforcement, and one thing I've learned is that the decision-making and problem-solving process in emergency management is critical for good outcomes. We're going to be talking about the decision-making process here today. And starting off, first of all, Stephen Jobs said, deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do. And what he's saying here is sometimes we have to decide that there's things that shouldn't be done, and that's not the same thing as simply not making a decision. We've made the decision not to do something at this point. Problem solving is a set of activities designed to analyze a situation systematically and generate and implement and evaluate the solutions, whereas decision-making is a mechanism for making choices at each step of the problem-solving process. Decision-making is part of the problem-solving. Emergency decisions have their beginnings before the emergency ever strikes. Decisions that people make prior to the decision in the planning process and all the things prior to the disasters come back, and they are what often creates the problems during the disasters. I mean, could you imagine Super Bowl? They get out there on the field, and between plays they run out there with the playbook and decide what they're going to do. Well, a team doing that wouldn't have even got to the Super Bowl, would they? What are some of the decisions you should make as a CERT team that are not made, that in advance can hurt you and your team? Some of the different decisions you make is your plans on how to go into buildings and at what point you should leave the building or make notifications. There's other things that you can plan for in advance, and then when incidents happen, the decision making's already been made, and it will then trigger what you're going to do, and it can save time, it can save people from getting hurt or even people getting killed. Some of the things that you make your plans in advance in are your jurisdiction's emergency operation plans, your standard operating procedures, and other procedural documents such as your CERT plans and your CERT field guides. The EOP, or the Emergency Operation Plan, will answer who's responsible for what, who's basically in charge, who's going to make the decisions. That way there can't be a discussion out there about who should make the decision. What organizations to use during the response and recovery. What triggers each kind of action. And this is a very important point, because by having trigger points, it can automatically make that decision at that point when you've reached that trigger. For instance, if you were in an operation and you're going to be out in the field for many hours, if you have a plan that calls for the temperature rising to 101 degrees, that instantly triggers people starting to rotate it in and out more frequently, or triggering mandatory breaks at certain times. That is a decision that's already made, so once the trigger's reached, it just automatically happens. We have to decide who's going to do the communication and how it's going to take place, and under what conditions evacuation is going to be indicated. This is a very critical thing, because evacuations often have to take place rather quickly. Fire departments do this all the time. They've got a trigger that if a certain situation happens, the fire battalion chief or commander in charge is going to evacuate the people. They're not going to sit there and overanalyze the situation. A trigger point was reached. They just therefore do it. We're going to talk about the problem-solving process. And in the problem-solving process, there is a toolbox for problem solving. In the toolbox model that we're going to use here, There are 5 steps to the problem-solving model. Identify the problem, explore the alternatives, then we select an alternative, and after that alternative has been selected, we implement the solution, and then we have to evaluate the solution. I have my own personal toolbox that's helped me quite a bit through the years, and one of the things I have in my toolbox for identifying the problem, I kind of got these in college. Tarot cards are very good. I can sort them out and they can show me what some of the problems are. But also a tremendous source of information. I've got a horoscope guide, and I really love the National Enquirer. Yeah, here's where I get most of my weather. You may get Weather Channel, but this is just about as accurate to me as the Old Farmer's Almanac. I find these very helpful. So I can use those. So researching and finding the information on the problems can be a critical part in the problem solving. But if you don't want to use my toolkit, you can use the first step in the problem solving toolkit, identify the problem. Now a problem is a situation or a condition of people or the organization that will exist and is considered to be undesirable. A problem or a solution. A common error in problem solving is defining problems in terms of their solutions. We must define the problem before we can define the solution. So you've got to ask the right questions. Peter Drucker said the most serious mistakes are not being made as a result of the wrong answers. The truly dangerous things is asking the wrong questions. So if we don't ask the right questions about a situation, we really can't come up with identifying the problem or getting on the road to correcting the problem. When we're deciding trying to analyze or determine what the problem is, one of the things we have to determine is what's happening. So we're doing a size up at a scene, we're doing a size up at a situation. We've got to know what's happening. What caused the situation out there? What are some of the life safety factors? What are some factors that are coming to play with it? We have to know who's involved in this, and we have to know who the stakeholders are. The stakeholders might be the victims or people affected by the disaster or the incident. The stakeholders are also the emergency responders, but it can also be the community at large, political people that are involved in the situation. Who's going to be affected by this problem if we don't solve it correctly? We're going to look at a case study here now, and I'm going to read to you a situation, and then we'll discuss it at length here and determine what the problem was. The situation is small town Missouri is a city of about 24,000 people located on the Little Grand River, 30 miles south of Kansas City. Small town has a growing population of retirees and elderly persons, many of whom reside in an assisted living community. At about 11 p.m., the local emergency manager receives a call forwarded from the emergency dispatch stating that the Owl's Nest Nursing Home's generator has failed. Owl's Nest is a nursing home assisted living community of approximately 250 residents who have been affected by the generator failure. Senior citizens are very susceptible to the effects of cold and dampness. For now, the Owl's Nest administrator has gathered the affected residents into the recreation room and is using blankets to keep them warm. This is not a good long-term option, however, because the temperature is expected to drop into the teens by early morning. So the question here is, what is the problem in this case study? Right from the beginning, what is the actual problem?
A bunch of people we got to keep warm.
Okay, a bunch of people we got to keep warm. In a very concise way, that's the problem. Some people have said that the electricity being out is the problem. Well, that's the thing that caused the problem, and getting the electricity on certainly might help solve the problem. But the ultimate problem here is that the people are going to be getting cold and they're susceptible to the cold. Okay, the next step in our problem-solving process is exploring all the alternatives. In my toolkit, one of the ways that I explore the alternatives is I have this nifty little black ball that can help me here a whole lot in exploring the different alternatives. Okay, this is great. It says the outlook is good. That's gonna help me a whole lot in this scenario. But this is one of the things I have in my problem-solving toolkit. But in your toolkit, you can explore the alternatives, and there's some ways that we can go about doing it. We can generate some alternatives, and there's a lot of different ways to generate alternatives. And then we've got to evaluate those alternatives. Generating alternatives can come from brainstorming or different other ways to find out information. And then once we've got them, we have to look at each one of them and just see how practical they are. Referring back to the case study we had on the nursing home, what are the alternatives that we have available for us?
At least keep them warm, then depending on how long it's going to take to get the generator back online, at least we have something as a short-term solution.
So we could bring some more blankets in. And some people said we could get another generator. Another alternative that was mentioned is that getting some more blankets in there from the Red Cross. And what were some of the other alternatives? What process did you use to generate these alternatives? How did you come up with each of the alternatives that we've talked about here? Look at your job aid here. In the packet, there's a job aid here, and look at step 1, and it has a checklist there for you that shows you a structured way to go about identifying and analyzing the problem. But here are some of the ways that you can generate alternatives. One of them is brainstorming. This is what I talked about a minute ago, where we can throw out a lot of different ideas to come up with the alternatives. Brainstorming isn't an intense thing where we overanalyze these things. Everybody throws out some different ideas. We put them on a board or we put them on a chart and take a look at them a little bit later, but we don't want to shut off the flow of different ideas at this point. Then in the next step after the brainstorming, we're going there and looking at them closely. We can sort out which ones really are practical and which ones aren't. In a non-emergency situation, we can use surveys. Prior to the incidents, we could have surveyed nursing homes and assisted living centers on how they would or could keep their people warm in case of emergency. We could have talked to other emergency management organizations, or we could have talked to the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, organizations that normally provide relief. So surveying them, and we develop a list of the best practices, and if we have those types of that type of information in the beginning, then it's easier to make the decision. Another non-emergency way is that we can have discussion groups. You can invite a group of people that are affected, some of the stakeholders such as the nursing home people, or just general groups who are involved in emergency management, and we can discuss different alternatives and different options. Look at your job aid, the second step there, and there's a tool there for analyzing and evaluating the alternatives. Okay, the next step in our toolkit, in my toolkit, the next step is to select an alternative. And one of the ways that I go about selecting an alternative is I have this wonderful little Ouija board here. Yeah. I've had it since my college days, and it's helped me decide. I was dating people, and it's like, now which one really should I, Okay, well, with a little help from my current wife, it helped me select whether I should get married or not. But this was a wonderful tool for that sort of thing. But I don't know if there's room in your cert pack for that type of a toolkit. The third step in our toolbox is to select an alternative. We have to look at the different available alternatives to us and then make a choice. Which one's going to be the best alternative for us? Here's some of the different factors, and they're not necessarily in order, but here's some factors that we have to take into account. Whether we like it or not, we have to take into political factors. Politicians are responsible to the public. They're ultimately responsible for the outcomes of how our disasters are handled and what the response is. So we certainly have to take into account the political factors. Safety factors always have to be considered. Life safety for you, life safety for the people that are victims of the disaster have to be the first thing. And to me, life safety although we're willing to risk ourselves a little bit, your safety is probably one of the highest concerns, because you're the ones with some training, you're the ones with some equipment, you should be the ones with communication. Your personal safety, for you to have an alternative that puts you in unnecessary jeopardy, that's not a good solution. So your safety first, because you can't help people if you can't get there, can you? You can't help people if you get yourself hurt, and if I'm the emergency manager or I'm the police commander out there in the scene, the last thing I need now is some injured CERT personnel as well as the victims out there. Financial factors are certainly a consideration. If you're faced with two different alternatives, maybe both of them are equally acceptable, but the financial aspect of it weighs more heavily on one, then we need to look at which one's going to be the cheapest. About 20 years ago, there was some flooding along the Missouri and Mississippi River. The emergency managers were having to make a decision on what to do about the flooding, because there was an industrial park that was just about ready to be flooded when the water would overtop the levee. There was also a large farming area where thousands and thousands of acres of good bottomland were in jeopardy. The emergency managers had to make the decision, and financially, which was going to be the best decision. Do we flood the industrial park? Do we flood the farming land? And ultimately, they decided to blow the levee and let water into the farming area because it would cause less economic damage. And it was also safer, too, because flooded farmland didn't create the safety factor of a flooded chemical plants and industrial areas that could be causing some problems, which we'll cover here in a second. The environmental considerations. The environmental considerations were much better by blowing up the levee to the farmland than it would be to the industrial park. The final factor we have to consider is the ethical factors. In any decision making, sometimes we have a situation where one group of people or one person or party may be affected more than the other by the decision, and we have to make sure that when we're making that decision, it's made on good, solid ethical grounds. Look at your job aid number 3. It'll show you some of the what's considered the best solutions, or how to determine the best solutions in the problem-solving model. The next step we have, after we've selected all the alternatives, is we need to implement the solution. That's, for me, one of the easiest things to do, because in my toolkit I have...
That was easy.
I have an easy button, and that makes it the easiest thing for me to implement. I just smack the button. But in the real world, this is probably one of the most difficult steps, is to try to implement it. So when we start to implement the plan, here's some things that we need to do. We develop an action plan. In incident command, we talk about the incident action plan. Then we're going to determine the objectives from this plan, and these objectives are what's going to drive this operation, because by going after the objectives, by trying to achieve the objectives, when other things come up, we aren't distracted doing those other things. We can concentrate on doing what we set out to do unless some emergency dictates otherwise. After we've determined the objectives, we have to determine what kind of resources we need to use to carry out these objectives. We identify what physical resources, what personnel we need, what equipment we need, and we have to plan for the long-term carrying out this operation. We've got all these, now we start building the plan, and then finally when the plan's in place, we implement it and start carrying it out. Look at your job aid, step 4, is that there's an action planning checklist of the different things you need to do as you're putting this plan together. The final part of our problem solving is, after we've implemented it, the problem solving doesn't stop there. We're going to have to see if the plan's working. So what we have to do is constantly evaluate and monitor the situation to see if it's working okay. For me, that's, once again, pretty easy. I can look here into my crystal ball and I can tell if everything's going to work out in the future. ADM, there's no place like home. We can't do that in the real world, so we have to be watching what's happening and constantly making course corrections as to what we need to do. If we see that the objectives are not being met, if we see that we're not achieving what we're setting out to achieve, but that we're going off in other directions, we can make course corrections and go back to what we wanted to do in the first place. So we have to constantly monitor, and we check them against our plan and against whether our objectives are being completed. So we're going to constantly evaluate the situation, we're going to monitor the progress, and we're going to evaluate the results for their effectiveness. Take a look at job aid number 5, evaluating the results. It'll show you how to go about evaluating the results to see if you're achieving your objectives. Next, we're going to talk about ethical decision making and problem solving. Here's a definition of ethics: a set of standards that guides our behavior both as individuals and as members of an organization. In this definition, we're talking about basically a rule book or a code of conduct. Certain organizations have their rule books or code of conduct that helps guide them through this. The second part, or the second definition here of ethics, is principles of right and wrong, such as being honest, fair, treating others with respect. This is a definition of character. This is not a set of rules, but it's what's internally in you and your basic sense of right and wrong, fairness and justice. Benjamin Franklin said, "So convenient a thing to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find a reason for everything one has a mind to do." What he's saying here is when someone's determined to do something wrong, they can find all kinds of reasons or excuses why they should be allowed to do that. Ethical don'ts. Don't exceed your authority or make promises. As a CERT member in a CERT team, there's only a limited authority you might have in a situation, and the best thing is to simply refer people to people in charge or in authority to make decisions or to handle those situations that require some use of authority. And you certainly don't want to make promises, especially ones you can't keep, because if you don't keep the promises, your CERT team is going to look bad, and it's simply going to confuse the people or raise their expectations unnecessarily. Don't use your position to seek personal gain. For example, you don't want to solicit gifts. You don't want to make decisions based on something that would benefit you financially. You don't want to use your agency time or property for personal reasons. Do some of your CERT teams have trailers? Do some of you have chainsaws? Okay, there's been some storm damage and you got a couple of badly damaged trees in your yard, so you get one of your buddies, or maybe you've got your own trailer hitch, you hook it up, the CERT trailer, and you take it over there and you get out the CERT chainsaws and you cut down all the trees on your own property. Would that be a nice thing to do? Well, it'd be a nice thing to do, but it wouldn't be an ethical thing to do, would it? Because you're using CERT property for your own personal benefit. You don't want to use your position for product endorsement. Your CERT team may be using certain products, but it's not for you or your team to be making statements for these products to help some company for financial gain. When you're faced with an ethical situation, just remember there is no right way to do a wrong thing. Here's some ethics checklist questions to ask yourself. Is it legal? Will I be violating either civil law or agency policy? What we don't want to do here is confuse legal with ethical or moral. They're two different things. It'd be nice if they're always the same thing, but a thing can be legal and not ethical or moral, or it could be the other way around. Ask yourself, is it balanced? Is it fair to all those who are concerned in the short term as well as the long term? And one of the best ways to know if something's ethical or not is generally just ask yourself, will it make me proud? How will I feel about myself after doing this? If you're not feeling good about yourself, that's probably a good warning that you shouldn't be doing it. Now, here are some ethical do's, though. Place the law and ethical principles above personal gain. Always act impartially. Protect and conserve your CERT team's property, and always put forth an honest effort. We're going to go to an activity now, and we'll discuss the ethical implications of 4 scenarios here that we will read. In our first scenario, a neighbor gives you your CERT team tickets to the Chiefs football game for assistance during a disaster. What are the ethical implications involved in this scenario? What would the ethical thing be to do? In our next scenario, a reporter on the scene where you're conducting a grid search offers money for information on the operation. What are the ethical considerations in this scenario? What would the ethical thing be to do? Your CERT team is getting ready to buy t-shirts, and your cousin owns a t-shirt shop. He asks you, what's the current low bid on these t-shirts? What are the ethical considerations here? Should you buy them from your cousin because he's going to sell them to you lower? Should you give him the bid? Because after all, maybe by giving him that low bid, he'll even make it lower and you'll save some money. You know, what are the ethical implications here? And what would be the ethical thing to do? In our last scenario, you're searching a public area and you find $100 on the ground. No one in the area can see you and no one knows that you found the money. What would you do with the money? What are the ethical considerations in this scenario? What would be the ethical thing to do? Let's talk about some components of ethical decision making. We're going to talk about commitment, consciousness, competency, which involves evaluation, creativity, and prediction. The first one is commitment, motivation, simply wanting to do the right thing in the situation. To make ethical decisions, you've got to have a commitment within yourself that you want to do what's right. The second consideration is consciousness, awareness. You need to be aware that there is something ethically wrong with it. The more experience you have in your CERT training, the more experience you have in life, hopefully the more conscious you're going to be aware of the ethical implications. The third factor is competency, or the skill to recognize an ethical decision or an unethical decision. You've got to have the ability to evaluate the situation. You've got to have the creativity, and you've got to be able to have prediction, the ability to look a little bit into the future and see, if I do this, how is it going to look? How is it going to turn out if I do this? So you have this foresight to see how it's going to turn out in the future, at least to a little bit. Ethics isn't a new concept. Shakespeare said, above all, to thine own self be true. And that's as true today as it ever is. Next, we're going to talk about decision making in emergencies. For a CERT team, this is probably one of the most important parts and hopefully one of the most interesting parts. The need to make a decision. Steve Jobs realized that with most decisions, making no decision was as bad, if not worse, than making the wrong decision. This isn't to be confused with what I talked about at the beginning of the class about making a decision not to do something. A decision was made after you've considered all the factors, and a decision was made not to do something. What we're talking about here is that indecision, that deadly indecision where you simply can't make a decision. What impediments to good decision making have you experienced or observed during emergencies when you were with a CERT team? Here are some of the impediments to making good decisions in an emergency. Time pressure is a major impediment. When you have minutes or even seconds to make a decision, you don't have time to go through the entire decision-making process. You have to act on what you know. The more training and experience you've had, or if you've got these trigger points that we talked about earlier in the class, it helps you make the decisions when there is time pressure. Political pressures will always be part of the emergency response because there's a lot of different political pressures coming to bear, different people putting pressure on you to do different things, so that's going to stress or be an impediment to the decision making. Your own physical condition has something to do with your decision making too. For instance, high and low blood sugar levels could make a difference. If you're needing to eat, if you're having your blood sugars going too high or low because of lack of nourishment, it can affect your thought processes. Caffeine can affect your thought processes too and be independent. Now, I'm not talking about the 1 or 2 cups of coffee in the morning. Coffee is a good way to get started in the morning for some people, and it helps them focus or concentrate. What we're talking about here is when you've had cup after cup after cup and your caffeine level is very, very high, it can affect how you're thinking and affect your processes. Fatigue is another major impediment to the thought process. People that are very tired don't think as well as people that are more rested. How does your decision making go after about 2 hours? Or how about after 20 hours?
My decision making.
Yeah. Your decision making decreases. They say that a person who has had sleep deprivation for over 24 hours is functioning about the equivalent to somebody who's drunk driving. And if you're functioning about at the level of somebody that would fail the sobriety test. Lack of information is probably one of the greatest impediments to decision making, because without good information, it's hard to make the decisions. But the problem is you're never going to always have all the information you need. At some point, you have to go ahead and make the decision, but you do it with as much information as you can. Also, you're going to get conflicting information as you're getting lots of information. You have to sort this information out and pick the best, but the conflicting information certainly is an impediment. And there's always going to be some uncertainty, but you can't let the uncertainty stop you from making the decision. At some point, you have to say, we've got enough information, this is the best information, we've got to go with it. When you're under stress, several different things can be happening and affecting you. People tend to experience conflicts with others, team members, with other teams, with the people in authority. Because under stress, you're not getting along as well. You tend to perceive things selectively. You tend to focus more sharply on some things, ignoring others, and sometimes you miss a lot of very important information. And you might have poor judgment because you're stressed, you're not getting all the information that you wanted, and having to make that judgment. People under stress are usually less tolerant for ambiguities, for things that aren't real clear. When you're under stress, you want to focus on things and you want straight factual information, and when you get information that's less clear, it causes some problems and you're less tolerant of this. You have a decreased ability to handle tasks, and there's a tendency in some people towards aggression or towards escape. Either they're ready to snap somebody's head off or they're ready to just throw things down and walk out of the room. When we're working under stress, we tend to focus often only on our immediate goals and tend to shut out information that's not related to those immediate goals. We sometimes will choose risky alternatives just to get the decision made because we're under stress, and we have tunnel vision. All we can see is what's directly in front of us, and it's like a horse with blinders. We're blinding out everything else that is out there and only looking at the one thing. Another danger of making decisions under stress is the possibility of succumbing to groupthink. This is where the group is looking at the situation and we make the decision based on what the group is thinking without looking at all the alternatives and without looking at all the facts. An example of groupthink was the Challenger disaster. This is where the Challenger space shuttle blew up during its launch. Before the space shuttle was launched, as they're getting there in the final hours of the countdown, there had been some concern by some of the engineers about the O-rings in the space shuttle that were gaskets that separated different parts of the rocket engine. And some of the engineers had saw some possible problems in there. But as they're getting into the meeting, the junior engineers and the senior engineers and the project managers are all talking about this. And as a result, they went ahead and decided to go ahead and launch. The engineers that were concerned about the O-ring were concerned about or took into account what the senior engineers and the management was saying. And one of the things that happened in groupthink is you tend to accept the decision of the group because, one, you think maybe they know better than you and you kind of join into their decision. Or even if you have some reservations at it, there's a thing called self-censorship. If all these other people think that it's okay, do I really want to say that it's not okay because maybe I'm not right? So there's a concern that and lack of confidence in your own self in the decision making. To avoid groupthink, people have to be willing to express their ideas and to discuss them and not be afraid of what the group thinks. You may still come to the same decision, but at least it's been brought out. But groupthink can be a major impediment because within the CERT team, we tend to, it's kind of going along with the crowd because, well, they seem to think it's okay, so even though I'm not sure, I'll go along with it. In this course, we've talked about the 5-step problem-solving model, ethical decision-making, and decision-making under stress. This has been a condensed version of the FEMA Independent Study course, Decision-Making and Problem-Solving. If you've enjoyed this portion of the course and you want to go into a more in-depth study, you can complete the entire course online on the FEMA Independent Study website.